Hi, it's Mr. Bennett, and in this video what we need to talk about is we're going to talk about cellular respiration. I warned you this was coming at the end of the photosynthesis video. Now, in our last video we talked about photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is all about how plants take sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and they make oxygen and glucose. Now, glucose is really the important thing. This stuff right here is glucose. That's really what the plant wants to make, is glucose. So the whole purpose of photosynthesis is to make this stuff right here, glucose. Well, the whole purpose of cellular respiration is to take this glucose and send it to the mitochondria, where the mitochondria can take the glucose and use it to make ATP. And that ATP is going to be what's going to keep the cell alive. So the whole purpose of photosynthesis is to make glucose. The whole purpose of cellular respiration is to make ATP. So photosynthesis, to sum it up, photosynthesis is how food is made. Cellular respiration describes how food is used. Now, pretty much every living thing does cellular respiration. There's a few bacteria that don't do cellular respiration, and that's it. All plants, all fungus, all animals, and most bacteria can do cellular respiration. It's one of the most important processes in biology because it's the best way to make ATP that keeps cells alive. So just like we started out talking about photosynthesis by bringing up its chemical equation, we're going to do the same thing with cellular respiration. Why don't you show you the chemical equation for cellular respiration to help you kind of see the big picture first, then we'll talk about the details. Now, just with as we did with photosynthesis, you are going to have to memorize this equation. That equation is C6H12O6 plus 6O2 is used to make 6CO2, 6H2O, and 36 ATP. Okay? What the cellular respiration equation is telling you is that you use glucose and oxygen to make carbon dioxide, water, ATP, and then also heat is made. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, that as you do cellular respiration, you make heat. Now, before you freak out, this is what you have to memorize, this part up here. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 is used to make 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus 36 ATP. Now let me show you a trick real quick that'll help you out. The chemical equation for cellular respiration and photosynthesis are very similar. Watch this. If I take this arrow and I change it that way, and I change 36 ATP to sunlight, I have the equation for photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus sunlight is used to make C6H12O6 plus 6O2. So if you memorize one, it's very easy to use that equation to make the other one. You flip the arrow and change sunlight to 36 ATP or 36 ATP to sunlight, and that's how you can easily go from the cellular respiration equation to the photosynthesis equation. Now, one more thing I want to point out to you is basically, cellular respiration does the opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis took carbon dioxide and water, these little molecules, and put them together to make a big molecule. Well, respiration does exactly the opposite. It takes this big molecule and breaks it apart to make these little molecules. Okay? Photosynthesis requires energy to happen. Photosynthesis absorbs energy from the sun to make it happen. Cellular respiration releases energy. That when you do cellular respiration, you release energy. One more thing about cellular respiration too. Cellular respiration is the whole reason why you breathe. Cellular respiration uses oxygen and makes carbon dioxide. Well, we breathe in oxygen. That oxygen goes to our lungs, where it's absorbed by the blood, and then that oxygen goes to the mitochondria of cells to do cellular respiration. As the mitochondria do cell respiration, they make carbon dioxide, which goes to your lungs, and you breathe it out. So cellular respiration is the entire reason why you have to breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So let's get into the details of cellular respiration and what happens during the process. So where does it happen? I already taught you that cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. This is in eukaryotes only. Prokaryotes can also do cellular respiration, but prokaryotes do not have a mitochondria. So for bacteria, they actually use their cell membrane to do cellular respiration. So that's where it happens. It happens in the mitochondria of eukaryotes, and it happens in the cell membrane of prokaryotes. Now, just as photosynthesis was a multi-step process, cellular respiration is also a multi-step process, and there's 3 steps involved. Glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. We have them right here. Glycolysis happens first. Glycolysis glycolysis is the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, and then finally after that is what we call the electron transport chain. Now in photosynthesis, if you remember, step 1 made things that were going to be used during step 2. It's kind of the same thing in cellular respiration. The glycolysis, which is the first step, is going to make things that are going to be used by the last step, the electron transport chain. And the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle is also going to make things that is going to be used during the electron transport chain. Now, all 3 steps make ATP. And remember, that's the whole point of doing cellular respiration, is to make ATP. But the final step is the one that really makes a lot. Glycolysis makes 2 ATP. Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle makes another 2 ATP. And the electron transport chain, it can make up to 32 ATP. So you get a little bit of ATP here, you get a little bit of ATP here, you get a whole buttload of ATP right there. So those are the 3 steps. So let's go through and let's talk about these 3 steps in a little bit more detail and what's going on. The first step in cellular respiration is the process of glycolysis. Now the word glycolysis tells you and describes what happens during glycolysis. The word glyco is an old word that means glucose, and lysis means to split. Literally what happens during the process of glycolysis is that one glucose molecule is split apart into make 2 pyruvates. That glucose is a molecule that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons in it. If you split that in half, you're allowed to make 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid, each of which has 3 carbons in it. So glycolysis we're going to take and we're going to split glucose apart, and in the process we're going to make ATP and then this other molecule called NADH. Now where this happens is this actually doesn't happen in the mitochondria, it happens in the space around the mitochondria. That's where glycolysis happens, is in the cytoplasm immediately around the mitochondria. And how this happens is glycolysis is a 9-step process. Here's all of the steps right here. You can see them right here laid out for you. Okay? And each of these steps is done by an enzyme. Now, when you take AP biology, you'd have to learn all these steps. We're not going to worry about it in this class, but each of these steps is done by an enzyme, eventually converting glucose into pyruvate is what we're going to end up doing. So the take-home message of glycolysis is we convert glucose into pyruvate. We're going to make some ATP, and this ATP can be used by the cell to do whatever the heck it wants to do. And then we're going to make some NADH, and this NADH is going to come over and it's going to be used by the electron transport chain. So that's glycolysis for you, the very first step of cellular respiration. The second step in cellular respiration is called the Krebs cycle, or sometimes called the citric acid cycle. About half of your biology teachers will call it the Krebs cycle. Me, about half of your biology teachers will call it the citric acid cycle. They're both referring to the same thing. Now, what happens during the Krebs cycle is we're going to take that pyruvate we made in glycolysis. So in glycolysis we made pyruvate, and during the Krebs cycle we're going to break it down. We're going to break that pyruvate apart. And as we do that, we're going to make some interesting things. We're going to make more of this molecule called NADH, same thing we made in glycolysis, and this is going to go to the electron transport chain. We're going to make another molecule called FADH2. That's also going to be used during the electron transport chain. We're going to make ATP, which we can use for whatever we want, and then we're going to make carbon dioxide. I told you earlier that cellular respiration is the reason that you breathe out carbon dioxide, because your mitochondria produce carbon dioxide as they do the process of cellular respiration. Well, the step of cellular respiration that actually makes the carbon dioxide is the Krebs cycle. So here we got a whale right here, and he's blowing out some carbon dioxide, and the reason why he's blowing out some carbon dioxide is because he has done the process of cellular respiration. Now, where does all this magic happen at? The Krebs cycle, I told you that glycolysis happens in the area around the mitochondria. The Krebs cycle actually happens inside of the mitochondria, is where the Krebs cycle happens at. So how does all this happen? Well, just like glycolysis was carried out by enzymes, the Krebs cycle does the exact same thing. We start out with pyruvate right here, and it's going to go through all of these different cycles. all these different steps. And here you can actually see the names of the enzymes that go ahead and do each of these steps. So it's going to go through this 10-step process involving 11 different enzymes, and ultimately what we're going to do is along the way we're going to end up making the stuff that we want. Here's where some NADH is made, okay? Here is where we're going to be making some ATP, is down here, and we're going to be making this NADH and this FADH2 that we want as we go through this 10-step process. So the take-home message for the Krebs cycle is we start out with pyruvate, and pyruvate goes through all these steps, and along the way we make the stuff we need. We make NADH, we make ATP, we make FADH2. Now, the FADH2 and the NADH, these guys right here, they're going to go off and they're going to be used in the electron transport chain. And once again, the ATP can be used wherever the cell decides it needs to use some ATP. So to kind of put together everything that we've talked about so far, we started out with glycolysis, and in glycolysis we took glucose and we converted it to pyruvate. As we did that, we made NADH and we made ATP. Now this pyruvate that was made in glycolysis goes into the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. This 10-step process happens, and we use the pyruvate to make NADH, FADH2, and ATP. We also make some carbon dioxide that's going to come out of there too. Now, this is the first two steps, and as mentioned, these two things that are made by glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, NADH and FADH2, they're going to go ahead and they're going to be used in the next step of the process, which is called the electron transport chain. So the third and final step of cellular respiration is the electron transport chain, Now what's going to happen is during the electron transport chain is the NADH and the FADH2 that we made during both glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, they're going to provide energy. And the energy from these molecules is going to be used to move electrons, and the movement of these electrons is ultimately going to result in the production of ATP. So we use NADH and we use FADH2. We also use oxygen. See right there where we got oxygen? Oxygen is required for the electron transport chain to happen. We're going to use these three things, and we're going to make ATP, and we're also going to make some water out of the deal. So that's the electron transport chain for you. Now, where the electron transport chain happens is the matrix membrane of the mitochondria. I told you during the video on the cell organelles that the inside of the mitochondria actually has a second membrane, and we call that, the space inside that second membrane, the matrix. And the matrix has its own special membrane going on there. So it's in the membrane of the matrix of the mitochondria where the electron transport chain happens in eukaryotes. In prokaryotes, this all happens in the cell membrane. Now, as mentioned, what's going to happen is the NADH and the FADH2 are going to provide energy that's going to result in the production of ATP. And the other important thing to remember about the electron transport chain is oxygen is required. The whole reason you have to breathe in oxygen is so you can do the electron transport chain. People who suffocate, the reason why they die is because they have no oxygen, so their electron transport chain stops, so they don't make enough ATP to keep them alive. So the electron transport chain is incredibly important, and is the whole reason we do cellular respiration. The whole reason for glycolysis and Krebs cycle is to provide the energy to make the electron transport chain work so you can make enough ATP to keep yourself alive. So that sums up the electron transport chain for you. So to put all three of these steps in the same area and see what we got going on here, we started out with glycolysis. In glycolysis, we took glucose and we split it apart to make pyruvate. The pyruvate went to the Krebs cycle. Now, during glycolysis, we made NADH, which is going to go to the electron transport chain. During the citric acid cycle, we took the pyruvate that was made during glycolysis to make NADH and FADH2. These are also going to go to the electron transport chain, and the electron transport chain is going to use the NADH and the FADH2 to make lots and lots and lots of ATP to keep you alive. So that's the whole process of cellular respiration. We start out with glycolysis as the first step. We move on to the Krebs cycle as our second step, and then we have the electron transport chain as our third and final step. And the purpose of all of these guys is to make ATP. All right, so this next little bit I'm not going to quiz you or test you hard on, but I just want to show it to you so you have an idea of what's going on here. I've shown you how carbohydrates, glucose, can be used to make ATP. Now, carbohydrates are things like breads and grains. Well, that's what we use to make ATP, but question is, what about something like a carnivore that only eats meat? You don't see wolves and dogs eating a whole lot of bread. How are they able to take protein then and make ATP? Well, your body has the ability to take something like protein and convert it into the things that can be used during cellular respiration. That your body can convert protein into pyruvate, which we talked about, or acetyl-CoA, and these things can go into the citric acid cycle and be used to make ATP. Also, your body has the ability to convert fats into things that can be used during cellular respiration. And so, while your body does cellular respiration the easiest with carbohydrates, your body has the ability to use proteins or fats to run cellular respiration so that you can make the ATP you need to keep alive. Both of these pictures show that. Show how your body is able to take multiple sources of food and use those to make ATP. So we've talked about cellular respiration. We've talked about how your body uses that to make ATP. Well, the problem with cellular respiration is it requires oxygen. Now, if you're just sitting at your desk, your body can easily get all the oxygen that it needs. But if you go out and you start playing a game of basketball or you start running, even though you start breathing harder, eventually your body runs out of oxygen. And so some of your cells, if you're running really hard or you're working out, actually start running out of oxygen. So how do these cells make ATP? They slip over to a process called fermentation. And what happens during fermentation is a way that your body can still make ATP without oxygen. Now, the downside of it is if you do cellular respiration, one glucose molecule can be used to make 36 ATP. If you do fermentation, that same glucose molecule is only going to get you 2 ATP. So your body much prefers to do cellular respiration so you can make more ATP. But if you're running out of oxygen and you still need to keep running, let's say you're getting chased by a bull or something like that, 2 ATP is better than no ATP. And so your body will switch over to fermentation if you need to keep running so you can have some ATP. But as soon as it can stop doing fermentation, your body will stop doing fermentation. So what happens during fermentation is we're making ATP. We're not using the electron transport chain. We're not using the Krebs cycle. All we're using is glycolysis. And we're using that to make 2 ATP. And the reason why we're doing that is because we have run out of oxygen. Now, where this happens is it happens in the cytoplasm. We don't even have to involve the mitochondria in this. Now, what can do this? There's only a couple of groups of animals that can do this. Bacteria, animals, and fungus can do this. Plants don't have to do this because they have all the oxygen they need because they can make their own oxygen with photosynthesis. Now, animals and bacteria do a type of fermentation that's called lactic acid fermentation. And any of you guys who have ever been involved with a sport have probably heard about lactic acid. You work out hard for a while, your body's going to build up some lactic acid. And lactic acid is what makes your muscles sore, and it's also what makes your muscles weak. Other types of bacteria and fungus can actually do what's called alcohol fermentation, where they're both the same thing. We're using glucose to make 2 ATP without oxygen, but we have 2 different results. Now, thank goodness animals do not do alcohol fermentation, because if that was the case, going for a run would get you drunk, and that would not be good, because this is how all alcohol is made by fermentation. Can you imagine you're running from a bear, and you're running, and every time you run a little bit harder, you get a little bit more drunk? Eventually, the bear's going to catch you, and he's going to eat you. So that's why animals need to do lactic acid fermentation. It's a way to make ATP without getting drunk. Now, how does this all happen? You don't have to worry about the details of this, but basically what happens is we take the pyruvate that we made during glycolysis and we combine that with NADH, and that allows glycolysis to keep going. It recycles that glycolysis so it can keep going and going and going. Now, based on how you do it, combining pyruvate with NADH is either going to make lactic acid or it is going to make alcohol. And that's the process of fermentation. But the main thing I want you to understand is fermentation is a way that you can make ATP without oxygen. Your body doesn't like to do it, but in a pinch, it can.